Hi, I'm Ron and welcome to PopScicle, where I talk about popular culture, science, and everything in between. In December of 2001, a good 20 years ago, I watched for the first time, as did everyone else actually, The Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Ring by Peter Jackson. Prior to that, I had been really excited about watching it because I was a fan of the books and a big fan of the genre of fantasy, which was my genre of choice for literature. So I was really looking forward to it. And days before it was released in cinemas in the Philippines, I happened to watch the premiere and I was blown away. Not only by the brilliance of the film itself, but by the experience of being there with people who similarly loved the lore and the books and the experience of watching that film together. It was magical from the very first scene with the voice-over narration of Kate Blanchett as Galadriel over the black screen. That got me. And I think that movie gave me a whole new meaning of the word epic, at least as it's applied to cinema or to films. And ever since then, I've been an avid fan of cinema. I started my blog on predicting the Oscars because I was really so obsessed about The Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Ring winning the Oscars that it deserved, which was basically all of the Oscars that were available, including Best Picture, of course. But of course, we know what happened. Didn't quite win the awards that it was supposed to win. But I really consider that as a milestone for me in my cinematic journey, in my journey toward my love of cinema. And so I decided to make this episode to celebrate that, but also to celebrate the other films that I think shaped my life in some way, particularly but not limited to my love of cinema. And so I'm going to talk about these films, not necessarily my favorite films that can come in a separate episode later on, but these are the films, including The Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Ring, that shaped my life. Now, I'd like to clarify that this is not a ranked list. I'm not going from the lowest to the highest, but it is in a particular order, and it's the order in which I had watched the films. I'm not entirely sure about the order of everything here. Like, I'm assuming that I watched a particular film at a particular time, but I'm not 100% sure. But I think I was able to watch each of these films at the right time, and that helped it have the impact that it ultimately had on me. Now, prior to this first film that I'd like to mention, I had, of course, watched several during my primary school days. I remember watching sci-fi films like Short Circuit and Cocoon, and I remember having a fond experience of watching these movies. But I don't think I really learned to appreciate cinema as an art form until I watched Cinema Paradiso by Giuseppe Tornatore, a 1988 film which of course is one of the most beloved films of all time by a lot of people. It deservedly won the Oscar for the best foreign language film, so-called at that time. And it's about cinema. I think anyone who loves cinema loves watching films about films. And this is one of the best ones that you can ever watch. It's a love story, not only about human love for each other, human to fellow human, but also for the love of cinema as an art. And so it's one of the perfect gateways for someone who would like to be immersed in cinema as an art form and how it can impact lives and how it can provide that inspiration and that background story to your own narrative, to the narrative of your own life. And while I didn't get to appreciate really Cinema Paradiso on the first watch because I was quite young at that time, as a piece of as a masterpiece actually. Even when I was watching it with a young mind, that wasn't a fully formed cineast mind yet. I guess I can say that. I realized, I knew when I was watching it for the first time that I was watching something that is not just like any other film that I've seen or will see. I knew even back then that it was a masterpiece that I would carry with me in some way. And while I didn't realize it at the time, it's one of the seeds that I began to cultivate in my love of cinema. Later on, of course, when I started really immersing myself in the art form as a viewer, and started really recognizing the brilliance of the art form, I look back on that movie and there's a strong sense of fondness with which I look back on that film. And part of me wishes that I could go back to the first time that I watched it, but with the mentality and the perspectives that I have now. And I'm wondering how much more I would have loved it with that new perspective. Next up, I'd like to discuss an animated movie. And some of you may be thinking it's a Disney movie. I love a lot of Disney movies. I grew up on Disney movies, of course. Aladdin, The Little Mermaid, Beauty and the Beast. These were all classics that I loved. But the one that I'd like to talk about, and this is not the only animated film in my list that I'd like to share with you. This one is probably unexpected. The film that I'm talking about is a 1993 Japanese animated film by Yoshiaki Kawajiri, and this is Ninja Scroll. So why is this in my list? It's not really one of my favorite animated movies, but this is the first animated movie from Japan that, upon watching it, I recognized it as anime. Of course, I had seen several other Japanese animation series and movies before that, including some works by Hayao Miyazaki and a lot of anime that were translated into Filipino, like Voltes 5, of course, which a lot of my peers grew up with. But I didn't have a recognition of any of those as anime. The term that, of course, we use widely now to describe Japanese animation, although Miyazaki doesn't like his movies being described or labeled as anime. This was the first time I knew that I was going to watch something that's called anime, and I enjoyed it. I think it holds a dear place in the minds and hearts of a lot of anime fans as well, given that it came out during a time when a lot of the best anime were coming out. But also, it was a very big eye-opener for me because I think it was the most violent animated movie that I've seen at the time, that I had seen at that time. Prior to that, like I said, I had grown up on Disney movies. So nothing came close. I think that was a bit of a shock to me. But given what I had seen of some other anime, again without necessarily realizing that what I had watched was called anime, I wasn't like completely shocked about the violence. But it was still quite a lot. Anyone who has seen Ninja Scroll would know what I mean. There's a lot of blood in it. It's very bloody. But I didn't think it was gratuitous. But I had no concept of that word at that time when I watched it because I was very young. But it made me want more, and ever since then I've been a big fan of anime, whether movies or TV series. I haven't gravitated toward anime that are as violent as that one, although I have nothing against violent movies. I mean, Kill Bill, for example, is one of my favorite movies of all time. But yeah, I think that's why I included it in this list. It's primarily because of that. While it's not one of my favorite animated movies, it's the first movie that I watched that I knew was Japanese animation, which I would come to love as an art form also. So my next movie is probably one of the most highly regarded and respected movies of all time by film goers, by film lovers, and it's by Sidney Lumet, who just happens to be, well, until his death, one of the best directors of all time from any country. In 1957, he released this movie, 12 Angry Men. When I watched this movie, I was blown away by its intelligence and its power, its strength, and the fact that it was basically set in just one room, the whole movie. And I was thinking, and it's black and white. And my young mind at that time, I forget how old I was. I was a teenager at that time. I was thinking I'd be bored to death of this movie because it's so, yeah, because of the things that I mentioned. But at no point in the movie was I bored, and I was so engrossed in everything. I think that was the movie when I realized cinema is so powerful, given the direction of a masterful director like Sidney Lumet, and the brilliance of a cast that's so riveting in everything that they do and how they bring things together, that you can't deny the power of cinema. I think while I did, like I said, I appreciate already Cinema Paradiso for its beauty, mostly for its visual beauty and the way it evoked emotions. I think this was the one that really told me how much power a great film has or can have, and it's still unmatched to this day. It's not necessarily my favorite film, but I think it's up there in terms of sheer quality of its script, its direction, its acting. It's just simply one of the best, and anyone who has watched it would find it hard to disagree with me, I'm sure. It's a classic of American cinema, and rightfully so. Now, anyone who has been following my channel would know how much I love horror, whether it's in series or books or movies, but mostly movies. And of course, there have been a lot of scary movies that have scared me. I was tempted to put in Fire in the Sky, which really scared me as a child. When I watched that, I was scared to death of windows because I imagined that aliens were looking at me and were waiting to beam me up and dissect me. And of course, I had identified in some of my earlier episodes that The Exorcist is my favorite horror movie of all time. But my second favorite horror movie of all time is the one that I'd like to mention in this list for this episode, and that is Ringu by Hideo Nakata in 1998. This is the original Japanese version of The Ring. While the American remake is serviceable, it doesn't hold a candle at all to the original, which is one of the best horror movies of all time. Atmospheric, chilling, with one of the most memorable horror movie monsters of all time in Sadako. The sparse music and the sounds and the darkness of the film and the cultural flavor of it, rooted in Japanese myth. All of these coalesce into such a dark masterpiece, which is Ring. This is one of the movies which I watched with my friends in a room, lights closed, and we were all screaming at the right parts. We were all scared about, we were all terrified at the right parts. And I think that emphasized for me the communal experience of film. Of course, I had watched other movies together with other people prior to that, but there was something very profound and almost sacred about watching it not in a cinema with people that I didn't know, not in a small room with my closest friends. And one of the things I like the most about watching a horror movie is seeing how everyone else is reacting. When someone gets surprised, or when someone screams out in fear or terror, I enjoy those moments. Later on, I would read a book, which is also excellent, also scary in the written form. But of course, it's a visceral experience to watch it in the cinema, which I finally got to do. After watching it with my friends, I got to watch it in the cinema when it was re-released a few years later, and I got to experience Sadako in all her glory in in a cinema with a lot of other people. So that was another profound experience of that movie. This might actually be the movie that really got me interested in the horror genre, made me love it, and also possibly the one that made me want to make horror movies, because that's in my bucket list actually to make the scariest horror movie ever. And Ringu gave me the feel of what that should be like. Like I said, it's atmospheric. It's not jump scares, which I hate in horror. It's sustaining that atmosphere and that mystery, and something that's linked to the culture again and to myth, which in the Philippines we don't get to use a lot. A lot of Filipino horror movies, especially in recent decades, has been quite derivative of Western culture. When we should be mining so many scary things from our culture, like religion and local folklore and all of that. So there's a lot to mine, and this movie gave me that motivation to think of creating a horror movie. And in fact, I've been writing a script, which hopefully will get made into a movie soon. Now, I mentioned earlier when I talked about Ninja Scroll that I'd be talking about a few more animated movies. So here's another one. This is a 1995 release directed by Yoshifumi Kondo, and this is a Studio Ghibli movie, Whisper of the Heart. The terms charming, magical, cute, whimsical, all of these things have been said about a lot of Studio Ghibli movies, or Miyazaki movies in particular, and I love virtually all of them. In fact, as I was thinking of what films to include in this list, I was thinking of several like Nausicaä and Spirited Away, and even Kiki's Delivery Service, which I absolutely love. But out of all of those things, or movies from the studio, my absolute favorite is actually one that wasn't directed by the great Miyazaki Hayao, and that is Whisper of the Heart, Mimi wo Sumaseba. The fact that it's beautifully written, of course, and beautifully drawn, as all Ghibli movies are, but also it's a coming-of-age movie that is about dreams and aspirations and music and young love, which are a beautiful concoction to put together when done the right way. I think a lot of my favorite movies are a combination of those things. I'm a romantic at heart, I suppose. I like romantic movies that have music in them, and a bit of magic, a bit of fantasy. So it was a perfect combination of all of these things, wrapped in the best gift wrapping that you can have, which is Ghibli animation. I think it was also because one of the characters is an artist, a musician, which I'm not, but I appreciate anyone who is so passionate about his or her art, the way I am about writing, for example. And most importantly, this film is about love of literature. Both the lead characters love literature, and there's that underlying current of the fantasy, of the cat, the dreamlike sequences, which feed into a lot of the literature that I love. In fact, fantasy is the genre that I prefer the most. Even before I started going into sci-fi and horror, fantasy was my go-to genre of literature. So that playing a large part in the plot of Whisper of the Heart is part of the reason why it stuck with me for so long. And so this has become one of the films that I most recommend to people who ask me, what movie should I watch? There are several go-to movies when I'm asked that question, but this is definitely one of them, especially when someone asks me what animated movies they should watch. It's just really magical in so many ways, and that's why I love it so much. Next up is what I started this episode with, which is The Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Ring, directed by Peter Jackson. The first of the best trilogy of all time. Stephen Colbert even made a rap about it being the best trilogy of all time, and I agree. And it came at the right time. I was beginning to love cinema when I watched this movie. But if I could name one movie that turned things around for me, that made me really start thinking maybe I should get involved in film, it's this one. I was blown away by the whole experience of watching the movie at the premiere. I left that shaken and wanting to watch more, not just of Lord of the Rings, but film in general. In fact, after watching the movie, I remember buying this book, 1001 Movies You Must See Before You Die, and I set out to watch all 1001 movies, which of course I haven't. As of this recording, I have watched around 350 of them. Not bad, right? When I started in 2021, of course, prior to that, I had watched several of those that were in the list, but I didn't take the list seriously until that time, and that was because of Lord of the Rings. And again, I was so obsessed with it winning the Oscars, which I had begun watching many years before, that I started predicting Oscar nominees and winners. That was when I started my blog, Film Otaku. Actually, it wasn't called Film Otaku at that time. And I'm still predicting Oscars now. That started in 2001. And so, you can imagine my frustration and disappointment and bitterness at LOTR, FOTR, losing against A Beautiful Mind. Which, does anyone remember that movie even? Right? But anyway, yeah, it's still my favorite. Actually, it's still my favorite film of all time. The trilogy taken together. I know that's cheating, but that's really how I see it. You can't really choose among the three. But if I were to choose among the three, maybe it's Fellowship of the Ring, given what kind of a milestone it was in my life and how it started everything and how it, technically speaking, it's probably the best movie of the three for so many reasons. But really, it's here in my list of movies that shaped my life because of all of those reasons. And if I hadn't watched it, I probably wouldn't be the film fan that I am now. And so I owe it all to Peter Jackson, and of course to J.R.R. Tolkien, and to the movie itself. So after watching Lord of the Rings and buying the book, 1001 Movies You Must See Before You Die, I set out to watch as many of the movies as I can. As many of the movies in that list as I can. And so I started paying attention to European art films that I didn't really bother to pay attention to because the immature me thought that they were pretentious and boring and all of that. So I started watching silent movies. I started going to this video shop called Video 48 in Quezon City here in the Philippines, which is a treasure vault of classic Filipino movies. I started going there so often and purchasing some of the movies there. So I started also watching movie festivals or film festivals, and one of the biggest film festivals in the Philippines at that time was Cinema Nila. And I remember in 2003 watching a lot of these movies in several venues. And out of all the movies that I watched in that edition of Cinema Nila, there was nothing that marked me and affected me as much as Dogville by Lars von Trier. In fact, if I were to make a list of the movies that shook me to the core, this would probably be in the top 3. Anyone who has watched Dogville would probably understand why it's so different from so many other movies that you may end up watching. Even if you've watched other Lars von Trier movies prior to that, like Breaking the Waves, which is another excellent one, or Dancer in the Dark, starring Bjork. This one, just the way the set was created, just the way it was set up, the way it was directed, the way it was acted, the cast. And, if you haven't seen it, well, I don't know if this is much of a spoiler, but basically the whole set is essentially chalk drawn on the floor to signify where the houses are. But everything is open. So there are no actual physical structures except for a few props here and there. So it's all just the people. And they're led by Nicole Kidman, who I think has never been better than in this movie. Okay, maybe there are a few other movies where she's better. But I think this is definitely one of my favorite Nicole Kidman performances. And this is the movie that made me love Nicole Kidman. This is the movie that made me love Lars von Trier. I know that could be a controversial statement, but I do love Lars von Trier. He's one of my favorite living directors. And this is his best, I think. It was really unlike anything I had seen before. And the tragedy of Grace's life and her cathartic victory at the end stuck with me for a long time. If the other films in my list, that like 12 Angry Men, showed me how strong cinema can be or film can be, This showed me the limitless possibilities of how a film can be made, and also the brilliance and ingenuity and creativity of European directors. Prior to this, most of the movies I had watched were American movies or non-European movies. This made me want to watch a lot more European movies, and in fact, a lot of the other movies that I will be discussing later, are from Europe. So regardless of Lars von Trier's controversial personality, um, I will forever champion him as a director, even if for just this movie alone. But his other works are exceptional as well. It's just that Dogville is the film that I wish I could direct if I were to direct at all in the future, which is an interesting prospect because of movies like this one. Now, after watching Dogville, I decided to set out to watch as many European movies as I could, and of course, I explored the works of the masters. And Ingmar Bergman is one such master, and the first movie that I saw of his, which even before seeing the movie, I had already seen several iconic scenes of, like the chess match, right? I'm talking, of course, about the Seventh Seal, which was released in 1957, and it got me started on Ingmar Bergman, who is now my favorite director of all time. I've watched virtually all of his movies. I haven't quite seen all of them, but I really tried to look for all of his films after that and loved all of them. One of my favorite horror movies is his Art of the Wolf. He just has a different way of speaking about existentialism and doubt and faith and tragedy and all of those things that make life so miserable, so fragile. And I mean, well, Persona is one of the most important, most intelligent movies of all time. And that's an Ingmar Bergman classic. But this is what got me started. And of course, it's one of the most iconic movies of all time. Also, again, because of those scenes that have really left a mark in the collective consciousness of cinema goers. But really, the major reason why it's here in my list is because if I hadn't seen this movie, I wouldn't be the Ingmar Bergman junkie that I am now. And I'd be missing out on so much because he just really happens to be one of the true greats of cinematic history. Where my journey through European cinema led me to next was the trilogy Three Colors by Krzysztof Kieslowski. And the first movie in the trilogy that I watched was Three Colors Blue, which remains to this day my favorite out of all the three, and one of my favorite movies of all time. I already found it so profound and deep and moving when I first watched it, and I realized how brilliant Juliette Binoche is as an actress. But then when I watched it for a second time just a few months ago, I realized how much of an impact it had on me. Even my writing. I realized it's one of one of the short stories that I had gotten published, which is a rare romance short story, got a lot of its flavor from this movie. I don't think there's a better movie out there about how humans respond to tragedy and the sense of human connectedness before and after that tragedy that makes you question what it's all about, what life is all about, and what it's all for, and what human connection is all about. And that has influenced my writing more than I thought it did, which I just realized after watching the movie a second time. It's so heart-rendingly beautiful, this movie. Um, the two other movies in the trilogy are just fine, especially Red. White is the least of all the three. Red is really great as well. I think I should rewatch it. But Blue is on a whole other level. Now, I mentioned earlier that I also started exploring Filipino cinema, which I have grown to love. I must admit to having had quite a negative perspective on Filipino cinema, given that what I grew up on was a lot of slapstick comedy, um, which isn't really the best that Philippine cinema has to offer. But then when I started watching classics by Lino Broca and Peke Galiaga and the other greats of the art form, Mike De Leon, of course, who's my favorite Filipino director of all time, I got to watch the jewels, the real jewels of Philippine cinema. And there are so many movies that I could have included in this list for the sheer quality of them. But again, this is a list of movies that shaped my life in some way. So if I were to choose one such movie, that's Oro Plata Mata by Peke Galiaga, a 1982 movie. I had watched Lino Broca movies before. I love them. Tilimbang Kang Ngunit Kulang is one of the absolute best. But this just really took my breath away. The way it was filmed from start to finish, how heavy it was, how it spoke about war and war as a source of horror and loss of faith in humanity. And that whole sequence as the characters were walking past the burning fields, that has stuck with me until now. And that's probably one of the best images in Philippine cinema of all time. Prior to this, I had known Peke Galiaga for prosthetics-heavy horror films like the Shake, Rattle, and Roll movies and some fantasy films. So I was shocked. I didn't expect that he'd have this in him. It just happens to be one of the best Filipino movies of all time. Now, the last animated movie that I'd like to discuss here is one of my favorite movies of all time. It's probably in my top 3 now. I went to Japan and had to take photos in one of the places that were depicted in the movie. And of course, I'm talking about Kimi no Na wa, Your Name by Makoto Shinkai in 2016. One of the best animated movies of all time, I think. And I've watched it a gazillion times. Every viewing experience is different. It still makes me cry, still makes me laugh so much. The music is by Radwimps, it's outstanding. The art is breathtaking. And the story is so involving and tender and captivating. You know that red thread, which is a common trope actually, but was highlighted in this particular movie, destiny and all of that. That is something that I've incorporated in a lot of my writings since then, including the book that I'm writing now. And so definitely this movie has influenced me a lot. The idea of destiny as a red thread and time being so malleable, all of these are fascinating to me. I'm honestly worried about the live action movie that they're planning to make or that they're in the process of making. I don't know. But it has Makoto Shinkai's go signal, and Makoto has actually been advising them on it, I think. So I'm still looking forward to watching it, even if I am worried. Of course, I'm not expecting it to be anywhere near as good as the animated movie, because it's gonna be hard to match it. Even Weathering with You, which is a great movie, failed to capture or didn't quite capture the magic of Your Name. Lightning in a Bottle, I think. I love the works of Mamoru Hosoda as well, but this movie is just on a different level. The last movie in my list is one of the oldest in the list actually, but it's the most recent that I watched. I just watched it during the pandemic when I found myself having a lot more time to watch movies. Remember, I've been trying to watch as many of the 1001 films as I can. And finally, I found the time to watch Sansho the Bailiff by Kenji Mizoguchi, a 1954 movie. And I was left speechless. After that movie, it's so profoundly powerful. And I can appreciate now why people who watched it for the first time back then were so in awe of that film. I think it's one of the best movies that has ever been made by anyone from any country. It speaks about the human condition so well. Tragedy and compassion, humanity, all of that. It's scarring, it's deep, it's painful, but it's also hopeful. It's so well directed, so beautifully shot, so beautifully acted. It's a perfect movie. I don't use the word perfect. I mean, I didn't even use it for Your Name, which is one of my favorite movies of all time. But if I were to use that word for any movie in this list, it would be for this one, Sansho the Bailiff. It's not a film to watch when you're not in the mood for something very heavy. Definitely not, so I won't recommend it for that. But if you want to watch cinema at its best, there are few better options than Sancho the Bailiff. Right after watching it, I really started thinking more and much more seriously how I wanted to become a filmmaker. That was when I started really looking at film programs that I could enroll in after finishing my PhD in biology. Maybe I could take a master's in film. And I'm still thinking about it. Sancho the Bailiff gave me a push to really seriously consider it, which I am doing now. So if I ever end up being enrolled in a film program and ever end up finishing it and maybe even end up in the film industry as a director or as a writer, it's due to all of these films that I've watched and that are in my list. But Sancho the Bailiff was the last one that gave me that ultimate push. I love cinema. It's the best art form, in my opinion. Nothing quite as effectively captures the human condition and all of the beautiful and horrible things about it. I love reading books, but there's just something different about seeing moving pictures, moving people, and all of these things brought together: the cinematography, the music, the production design, actors. And watching movies has shaped so many other aspects of my life, such as my writing and the way I see the world around me. Definitely all of these films that I've listed have influenced me in one way or another. And I think I can consider myself a much better person for it. So these are the films that shaped my life. What are yours? I'd love to hear about your own list. But if you liked this episode and you would like to see more, don't forget to subscribe to PopScicle so that you may be alerted to new content in the future. Bye!